Hi everyone. We just want to give some quick video guidance on the latest update on the rubric section and how criteria should be crafted. There's been some slight changes that we want to make you aware of, and hopefully this video can help in understanding these changes. So to start, um, your criteria should be easy to judge for reviewers. They shouldn't be vague or overly subjective, and you should be sure to include relevant points. Um, Secondly, at a high level, these criteria that you provide should ultimately formulate a rubric where you can determine whether a response is good or bad. Um, so ultimately, if you were to answer the questions within the criteria of the rubric, it would discern whether the response is good or bad. This means that um, any sort of criteria that does not actually help you understand whether a response is good or bad. So, it's indicating it's a criteria like uh, is the response must include a header that has exactly 10 letters. If there's no sort of reason to have a criteria like that, and it doesn't actually help you understand whether the response is good or bad, then it should not be included. So again, ultimately, the point of the rubric criteria is to help you discern, a good response from a bad one as an objective way as possible. Number three, the criteria should ideally be able to be answered as true or false. Um, you know, some criteria maybe seem to be more objective versus others. Like, was this specific factuality question answered accurately? Um, some things might be a little bit more objective to start, but as best as possible, the criteria should be phrased in a way that, a reviewer can look at it and be able to answer true or false, like this response meets this criteria or it does not. Um, Additionally, it should be, and this kind of ties to the next point, which is a question of objectivity. It should be phrased in a way that's specific enough, potentially using examples, such that, 75% of people or more would kind of come to the same conclusion here. So a bad example, as shown here, is just like the response should scare me, or the response should, intimidate me. The reason why this is bad is because there's no real criteria or like guidance around this criteria that would lead 75% of people or more to the same conclusion. On the other hand, a criteria like this, where it says the response should invoke a sense of fear by using literary elements such as ominous foreshadowing, unsettling imagery, tense pacing, or similar devices. This is significantly better because um, it gives concrete elements for people to anchor on, identify the response, and objectively say, like, yes or no, does this response contain these elements? Whereas, the bad example just kind of gives a vague or blunt conclusion, which is hard for people to align on because inherently that's sort of a subjective criteria. Um, so that kind of actually leads to the next point as well, which is, being or including specificity in your criteria as a means towards getting to objective truth. So similar to the above point, where you kind of need to be specific, you should avoid criteria such as, the response must mention the first man on the moon. Um, in this case, I think the prompt was asking something like more direct and more factual. In this case, we should say something like the response must mention Neil Armstrong as the first man on the moon. Um, because ultimately, it wasn't just I think the criteria needs to be more specific. In this case, specifically calling out Neil Armstrong as that first person on the moon. Because this is leading to an objective, truthful answer as well. Number six, the criteria that you provide should be exhaustive but not superfluous. This kind of ties into point number two, as I was mentioning earlier, where the ultimate goal of the rubric is to essentially understand whether a response is good or bad. So there's going to be key points that are table stakes and that need to be included. However, after a certain point, um, not everything needs to have a criteria, and it's possible to make up criteria that either aren't applicable or aren't necessary. So you have to find the right balance between, you know, is this additional criteria actually necessary in understanding whether this is a good or bad response? So that I would say there's no magic number. But again, the test you should be using is if I answer these questions, will it determine and like reveal whether the response is good or bad. Um, so kind of taking one click deeper into this concept of rubrics, um, the most common error that we've identified is again, when a criteria is too vague to kind of yield that yes or no answer that we're looking for. So for example, maybe we have a prompt about prime ministers. Um, in this case, a very vague one would say something like, the response must mention the number of terms each prime minister did in office. Um, the reason why this isn't a great criteria here is because it could be a lot more specific, calling out specifically which prime ministers have, how many numbers of terms that they served. Because the way that the vague criteria is worded, it doesn't actually say anything about like the 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 number of terms being accurate. So just sort of having any number of both prime ministers and any showing any numbers associated with them would actually be okay under this first criteria, which is too vague. Similarly, just like the response must include key points of the economic environmental debate in Brazil. This is a bit vague as well because it doesn't really define what a key point might entail or might look like. So that element is definitely up for interpretation. It doesn't give any sort of indication of how many or like what the limit is as far as like the number of points that are included. The second criteria provided here on the right is significantly better. So the response should include key points about the economic and environmental debate in Brazil, such as the deforestation of the Amazon, trade-off between agriculture expansion versus conservation, mining and infrastructure projects, among others. So it gives a few examples and is significantly more specific compared to the first kind of vague criteria here, which is much more open to interpretation. And kind of going back to what we discussed on the prior slide, um, that first one is unlikely to yield kind of a 75% plus agreement if it were to be shown to people. So additionally, you're probably already familiar with the um, kind of criteria categorization. But as a final walkthrough, there's three main categories. So, objective, kind of factuality oriented, a sort of criteria that is not up for debate. So something like, it must contain a list of 5 films and it's, films A, B, C, D, E. These should be fairly clear cut. Uh, Second will be subjective criteria. So it might say something like, and maybe we can actually go back to some of these examples here. So, this one is a good example. So the response should invoke a sense of fear by using literary elements such as ominous foreshadowing, so on and so on. That it's not something that you can objectively count, similar to the couple of first ones in the objective category. It should yield like a 75% plus agreement. Um, However, it's not like inherently objective. The third category is formatting and presentation list related. So, things like, format the response as a list, use a table, bold this, um, so on and so forth. This third category we should avoid as much as possible. Um, well, maybe not as much as possible, but we should avoid overusing this one. This ties back to the point that we mentioned here in number 6, where we do want to be exhaustive. We do want to make sure that everything is included. But we want to avoid being superfluous. So, again, going back to our core tenant of, does this criteria, does this rubric actually help me understand whether the response is good or bad? So, more often than not, the formatting is going to be something that's fairly secondary, um, unless it's particularly critical to the response. You should really question whether it is, 100% necessary as a criteria for deciding whether this response is good or bad. Um, so again, I would just kind of scroll back through this video or through these slides themselves and review this page. I think this is going to be the most helpful in helping you understand the rubrics and their criteria. Um, Again, this may be slightly different than what you've seen in the past. So please be sure to stay up to date. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on Discourse.